Okay, welcome. Generous Theology, this is Brock. I'm with my friend Chuck. And Chuck, you sound rested, and I think that's because you had a chance to rest and do some things, just take you out of your normal routines, and you're back now. And I feel like this is a very auspicious time for us to speak because we're in the interim, Chuck. You and I have just finished our extremely epic and monumental working through Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, his volume 1, Prolegomena. And Chuck, it's just, I don't want to turn this whole discussion session into a love fest on Bavinck's volume 1, but it's hard to say enough good about it. But in light of that, as we transition here, I think we wanted to have a chance to maybe just talk with each other about the state of the union with respect to Reformed theology. So we can pretend, Chuck, that you and I are the presidents of Reformed theology, as if there were such a thing, and we can give just a fun State of the Union where we say where we think things are at a high level. And this is completely unscripted and unprepared. I didn't really come with an agenda. We don't have our text as we usually do whether we're working through Bavinck or one of the Oxford Handbook works. So we really are just in a position to wing it, to improvise. Maybe this is going to call out the jazz musician in each of us as we have to think on our feet about interesting topics. But the idea, Chuck, is just as we're closing out 2023, where do you see things at a high level with respect to Reformed theology in your own situation, in your own denomination, as well as maybe on a national scene to the degree that you feel comfortable talking about that, and maybe where you see us with respect to the rest of the culture in the culture wars and the larger engagements that are happening in Western civilization now. And that's a broad open-ended thing, Chuck, but I really wanted us to do that, to have that chance to really just say what are one of the top 2 or 3 things that are on each of our minds as really defining issues facing Reformed theology in this particular year that we're coming through, and as we set up to get into almost the second half of the 2020s. We're not there yet, Chuck, but we're getting there. So I just wanted to bring you up with that and just throw you out of the frying pan and into the fire with some ideas. And of course, I've got some of my own, but I just wanted to just throw it over to you to just say at a high level, what keeps you up at night? What also do you rest in? And where do you wish things were? And where do you see things are? And what are your concerns there? Let me throw it over to you, Chuck.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a big question, and I'll be interested in hearing some of your comments as well. So having grown up in a Reformed denomination and having been a member of that denomination for my whole life, my view of things often is fairly bounded by that particular tradition. And so I find myself often, learning more about other segments of the Reformed tradition that I often don't know nearly as much about. So to some extent, my own comments are really more a reflection of my own sort of background in the Christian Reformed Church in North America specifically, and in the Dutch Reformed tradition more generally. And what I would say is that when I look at that segment of the Reformed tradition, it's always been small, right? It's always been just a very small group, often for much of the time that the Dutch Reformed tradition has existed in America. It hasn't been particularly connected with American culture. In fact, in my own denomination, really until the 1950s or 60s, and maybe even later than that, it was, things that were happening in the Netherlands were far more important theologically and philosophically than anything happening in America. And in that sort of insular tradition, there's always the sense of being an immigrant, of being not necessarily a part, and concerns about, well, what kind of influence are we having, have never been as as important in that part of the tradition. And we in the Christian Reformed Church used to say things like we would talk to each other about how Billy Graham once said the Christian Reformed Church was the sleeping giant of the evangelical world. But what did that even mean? And what he meant was, what he was saying there was just that there was a fairly active academic tradition, and so a lot of people who were having influence in that area. But the sleeping part was that, but it wasn't really going much beyond that. And so what does that mean? And how do we deal with that? And what I would say is this: when I look at my own tradition today, I have two big concerns. One concern is the drift away from being distinctively Reformed and toward being just generally evangelical. As recently as 30, maybe 40 years ago, let's say 40 years ago, you could go to a Christian Reformed church anywhere in North America, and you pretty much get a sense you were in a Christian Reformed church, right? There was a unique way that things were done. You would walk in, and there would likely be the Christian Reformed symbol, which is a triangle representing the Trinity, and a cross overlaying it, representing the cross, obviously. And that would usually be up in the front of the church. You generally had traditional congregations, buildings with the steeple and with the same kind of furniture up front, and generally not a lot of decoration. You might have at most a couple of banners or things like that, but not a lot there. And then the music was always from the Psalter hymnal, and so you knew the old blue Psalter hymnal that was in effect from 1955 to about 1987 had 493 hymns in it, and so those were the 493 hymns you were singing from, and probably 150 of them never got sung. So you really were just singing out of maybe 300 and some songs, and so you knew them all. And you could go, you would look in, and you'd look up front, and you'd see the hymns that, marked up front, and you'd say, 444. Okay, we're going to sing A Mighty Fortress. Oh, okay. That kind of thing. And the liturgy was pretty similar. You knew that on Thursday nights in some communities, Wednesday nights in others, there was going to be catechism, there was going to be Sunday school. There was this way of doing things. Now, I'm not saying that we need to go back to that. I think there were some things there that were done more out of tradition than they were out of anything particularly theological. But what I've become concerned with is today in many Christian Reformed churches, you could walk in and not realize you were even in a Reformed church at all. You would have a lot of things going on with you might not have the traditional call to worship, and then followed by at some point a recognition of our sins and a confession, but then also the assurance of pardon that it's part of that. Things just, it's become more what I call the evangelical liturgy, which is 3 songs followed by a sermon. And the music also, who knows, you could be singing something that really is not particularly Reformed or doesn't necessarily even agree with Reformed theology, because it's the hot evangelical song of the day on the radio, and singing has gone downhill because now we primarily just sing the music that it's being performed up front by a band or maybe by music tracks, and so instead of the old singing in parts that was so common, people don't do that anymore. Some of them don't even sing anymore; they just listen. So that's one of the things that I have a concern about, and I don't think the answer is to just necessarily say, okay, well, we hit our peak in 1955, let's go back to that. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I am concerned that we have lost some of that uniqueness, and by losing that uniqueness, we've lost a lot of people. Younger people will say, well, I could go to the little Christian Reformed church that I grew up in, or I could get the same thing, but with a better band over at the local megachurch. Why don't I go over there? And they got 8,000 programs, and so they'll have something for me or my kids or whatever, and they won't ask me to be super involved in stuff, so I'll just go over there. So that's one of the concerns that I have, that we've moved away from uniqueness and a real focus on being Reformed rather than just being part of the evangelical world. The other concern I have is that, at least in the Christian Reformed Church, there's always been this, I forget who it was, but one of our theology professors years back used to talk about how the Christian Reformed Church was made up sort of a cord of three strands using the biblical imagery. And he would talk about one of the strands being some more pietistic, citing those folks who had left the old state Dutch Reformed Church, just and in the 1830s, and were concerned about pious living. And were very involved in things like home Bible studies and living pious lives, and those kinds of things. And then you had the second strand was a more reformational, the Doliancy, the Kuyper, and to some extent Bavinck and Dooyeweerd, and this academic, very concerned about transforming the world, being involved in God's kingdom. And that strand also was what created a number of excellent colleges in North America, and really got involved in a lot of those kinds of ministries. And then the third strand was what was often called sort of the Presbyterian strand, that there were always folks who were coming from other areas of Reformed, especially from the Presbyterian world, who the Presbyterian confessions, Westminster, those kinds of things tend to be a little bit different than the three forms of unity, in that they tend to be a little more specific. They tend to get into a lot more detail and can be a little more, I can't think of the word. It's not coming to the top of my head, but that was also a tradition then that sort of played into what was going on in the Christian Reformed Church, and could sometimes balance some things out, sometimes agreeing a little more with the pietistic side, sometimes agreeing more with the transformationalist side. And I think we're beginning to see some of that falling apart in the Christian Reformed Church. Some people call it the divide between more progressive and more conservative. I don't necessarily buy that. I know some of the issues are a little more progressive versus conservative, but it really is about, there does seem to be a growing divide between those folks who are really involved in engaging the culture and those who are really concerned about protecting themselves from culture. And in the past, there was always a good balance between those things. There ought to be a little bit of a push and pull, right? We have to recognize that the antithesis runs through everything. And so thinking about sin and thinking about protecting ourselves from sin is certainly an important part of what we do, but so is engaging the world. And so this balance was always a good thing, but it does seem to be, to some extent, falling apart. And my concern is, in falling apart, the denomination itself falls apart. And there does seem to be unfortunately, some movement in that direction. There's been, the denomination has gotten smaller over the years. At one point in the 80s, they were talking about, hey, we're going to reach 400,000 by the year 2000. Never got there. A couple of church splits certainly had something to do with it, but I think we're under 200,000 now today. And with a lot of the issues going on and a lot of the fights going on, it seems like there's less to fight over, but all that's done is made the battles more pitched. And so that concerns me as well. And what does that mean for the influence? What little influence there may have been, but what does it mean for that kind of influence? What does it mean for a Calvin College or a Dordt University? What does it mean for some of the work that's being done by various agencies that hit well above their weight? Organizations like World Renew, which does relief and development and justice work around the world. What does it mean if the denomination that all has come from all begins to fall apart? And so those are things that I worry about. Now, I will say, in the course of my worry, I'm also constantly reminding myself that if it's all up to us and if it's all up to humans, it's all going to fail anyway. And to constantly look at the failures of humans, well, humans fail. We're filled with sin. We're affected by total depravity. And so, of course, if we're relying on our own strength, we're going to fail. And I just need to remind myself that to some extent, what we really need to do is just make sure that we're relying on God. And if God has decided that the time has come for the end of the Christian Reformed Church and it's going to be replaced with something, then I have faith to know that he'll replace it with something maybe even better. Or if he decides that no, this isn't the end, he'll find a way. And to some extent, what we need to do is listen and trust, and to some extent rest in that. Not to be quiescent, not to just do nothing, but to also just listen and listen for where God is leading, and not worry so much about our own ability to handle these things, but rather worry about our willingness to just simply listen to where God is leading us. And so that's, after a fairly long answer that in some ways is somewhat discouraging about my own denomination, I think we have to be reminded that God is the God of encouragement, and he'll do what's best.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for that beautiful build out. Now, I would say that my own thoughts on this matter are perhaps timeless. And I want to clarify and explain what I mean by this. And of course, I used careful weasel words there because I said perhaps timeless, which introduces the possibility that it might not be. And one can achieve a lot in considering the contrasts between a Parmenidean ideal, which is this sort of reality, is this immutable, unchanging, fixed reality, versus the Heraclitean ideal, which is everything is constantly in change. Everything's in flux. You never step into the same river twice. And so with that in mind, I think in some sense, first of all, I would say to people who are in Reformed theology, in some sense, reality is still reality. The Parmenidean ideal of this universe that is built upon eternal, timeless, unchanging principles governed by a personal God who has sent his Son to die on our behalf. Nothing's changed. In that sense, it's the same message that we have today that the New Testament generation had 2,000 years ago, when people who had witnessed Christ alive, walking around, went out and spread and told the good news. So in that sense, nothing has changed. Now, however, I would say that perhaps 2023, and maybe more generally the last 5 years, and perhaps maybe a little bit in a little slightly wider scope, the last 15 to 20 years. And here I'm thinking about the time period of the new atheism. So maybe about 2003, 2005. Really, America, in the scope of my lifetime, has really changed in a significant way. And I would not have thought that prior to the start of the new atheism in America. So the first 30 plus years of my life were in this solidly Christian majority, culturally Christian society, shared values, certain ideas that were still fundamentally Christian ones, originalist ideas about the nature and role of God and government, duties toward one's fellow man, as well as duties towards God. Even though a modernistic assault had been in progress for quite some time, I think I can very comfortably point to the last 15 to 20 years as really being a collapse of sorts, in the sense of a really strong changeover. And if I can maybe place it demographically, I can say that this coincides with the transition, the exiting of the stage of the World War II generation, and the peak and subsequent exiting of the baby boomers. If you're a baby boomer, I'm not pushing you off the stage, and praise God that you're still here. But by and large, the World War II generation, the baby boomers, are leaving. And with that, there's really some sense in my own mind, Chuck, that my own generation, which is a Generation X, is really a different animal, and a much more modern animal, and much more of a discontinuity with the Orthodox past than I would say previous generation. And that was not the least bit obvious to me 20 years ago, that sea change was happening. So I think perhaps when historians look at the first 30 years of my lifetime, not me in particular, but the latter part of the 20th century, I think it's going to be exciting in some senses, but really the Pax Americana is a pause. It's a breath. It's a chance for the world to rest after the cataclysms of the major world wars of the early part of the 20th century. And so in that sense, even though it's still exciting times to live in, lots to talk about, but in many senses, a bit of a snoozer in terms of cultural changes. But I think the beginning of this 21st century is markedly and dramatically different. And things are happening, changes are moving along at a pace in our land, the United States, but I think also in the larger, formerly Christian West, at a pace that is astounding. And it really is astonishing for me to see it. And without trying to be jaded about this, Chuck, I really have started, I've really considered calling this collapse and this transition, I've considered calling us the Ichabod states of America. Somewhat wistfully, somewhat overstated, but Ichabod is a name, a biblical name that means the glory has departed. And I think with respect to the beautiful Christian era, that's largely true. We are absolutely in a secular culture now, and that flip from Christianity being the moral majority or the majority in the culture to this minority subculture is very jarring. And not just because it's me being affected by it, though of course I'm playing my part. We're living in this, and where there was a degree of biblical literacy even among non-believers prior to the recent cataclysm, I think one of the things that staggers me now is the complete abandonment of what used to be called the classics. And I don't just mean Christianity, although of course that, but for example, I think of literature in English departments. And a generation ago, if you would have said to me that Shakespeare would be evicted from his preeminent spot in the cultural mind, in the landscape, I would have found that hard to believe. And yet, Chuck, not only do you and I speak with the people who are not only non-Christian, but they are profoundly non-Christian. They are no longer even Christian adjacent. And so because of that, language is changing right underneath my own eyes. And a new culture is bringing a new grammar, a new sensibility, a new sophistication. And at this point, it's frankly unopposed in the secular West. And because of that, this was one of my big points in Reformed Dogmatics Volume 1. Chuck, when I read Bavinck in Volume 1, when he uttered that famous sentence, "There is no rosy future for Calvinism in the United States of America." When I read that 10 years ago, my jaw dropped. I thought, for sure, Professor Bavinck, while he's brilliant in many places, for sure this is a swing and a miss. And now, just 12 or 13 years later, in light of the large cataclysms culturally that have taken place, I wonder what I was thinking, and see Professor Bavinck as being almost prescient in being able to see 120 years ago what I could not see 10 years ago. And so what an interesting situation. Now there are some major concerns here, Chuck, that I'm going to build out, but I just wanted to establish that initial part. And maybe, and I'm going to throw this over to you in just a second, but maybe I can put it this way. When I was young and I thought about how am I going to talk to people about the gospel, the idea that I had and that many others had was, well, you study theology and then you go to the mission field and you go to somewhere in the world that is outside of the Christian West, and you talk to people who really don't understand, who don't have a biblical vocabulary and grammar and concepts and canon, and you tell them the good news. And now the mission field has come to me, has come to us. It is right here in America, and every Christian now my generation, who thought, well, that's mission work, that's something that people do over there. I think we are now faced with the realization that the mission field has come to us, and we had better recognize that fact. And I think it's becoming very clear. And I don't say all of that in a bad way, but change really is jarring. And so, Chuck, let me throw that over to you to bounce off, reflect upon. Maybe you have some different thoughts or perspectives on this overview. What do you think?
Yeah, I can't disagree with you on your analysis that we are living in a post-Christian society. That said, that there's a part of me that isn't, on the one hand, obviously, that's a bad thing, and that it would be nice if the majority of people in the world, or if all of them in the world, were Christians. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that there isn't some potential benefit. Christianity has really thrived when we're not in power, so to speak. Look at how quickly Christian church grew in the early years when it was actively being repressed by Rome, and look at how the church has grown in places like China, even today, where the church is in many ways suppressed. And you hear stories about how quickly the church is growing in places like Iran and parts of Muslim Africa. So there is a sense in which, okay, well, I think we have to remember that there can be some good that can come from that. I would also say, too, that there is also a sense in my mind that this era of Christendom that we sometimes talk about, there is to some extent especially in recent years, it's been a flawed Christianity. It has, to some extent, I think what we see in the West is the natural result of this flawed Christianity that came before, a Christianity that was tied up into power structures, a Christianity that was tied up into more cultural Christianity rather than theological Christianity, rather than confessional Christianity. I know in my own family's case, my late grandmother, when she became a Christian, prior to that, she thought she was a Christian already, right? She was baptized. She went to church on Christmas and Easter. She had her boys baptized. She had some of the trappings of being part of a Christian culture that was what existed, right? She was married in 1945, had kids between 1946 and 1957, and was raising her kids during the 1950s and early to mid 1960s. And that was still a heyday for the assumption that, well, most people are Christian and those who aren't are maybe they're Jewish or something like that. But there was this Judeo-Christian culture that was existing. And it took it being pointed out to her by a local pastor who refused to baptize her youngest son, my uncle, because he said, "You're not a Christian." And it took that, and it took some anger at him, first of all, and I'm going to prove that I am a Christian, and actually then opening up a Bible and then starting to realize what being a Christian was all about, for her to recognize that, oh, yeah, that just saying that you're a Christian, just living into certain traditions, being culturally Christian, is not really being Christian. And so there is maybe a sense, too, that what we're seeing today with the growth of the nuns, the people who when asked to check off on a list, what religion are you? They say no religion, none. In this era where fewer and fewer people associate with the church, is it a reflection of a significant change in belief, or is it a reflection of people no longer needing the church or wanting the church to give them some backing for their cultural Christianity, not a real Christianity? And is there a sense in which perhaps this new era might, in fact, strengthen the Christians who remain, make them more committed? Yes, it may be more difficult at times. Yes, we may go back to being more of a minority culture than a majority culture, but there might be some good that could come from that as well. And I don't know. It's hard to say. I know there are many people who are worried about repression against Christianity, but people have lived in that kind of situation and still do in many places today, and they still can live in ways that please God. And in fact, that's really our goal in life, right? Is to live a life that is pleasing to God and in which we enjoy Him as well. Yeah. So I'm not I don't see my comments as necessarily a disagreement in any way with what you've said, because I think you've properly analyzed sort of the culture. The question just becomes is what do we do with it? Is the answer trying to strive to get back something that we had 50 years ago? Or is the answer to say, well, 50 years ago, there were things that led us to where we are today. And so what we're really looking for is something more radical, something more unique, something more Christ-like. And it's going to be costly. But why worry about the cost on earth of something that will bring eternal glory? So those are some of the things that go through my mind as I think through those things. And I recognize, of course, that there's certainly a downside to being the minority in a culture. There's certainly a downside to having folks who are perhaps even actively opposed to some of the things that you bring to the table. But I think perhaps it is today we may need to recognize that we're past the point where we can recover what we had 50 years ago, even if we wanted to. And I'm not so certain of that. But even if we did, I think we may be past that. And now it's time to really focus on something new and something different and something that is God directed. Maybe some of these changes are coming from God, and well, certainly they are, because we believe He controls everything. But maybe maybe it's designed to get us to be more purposeful about our theology and more purposeful about how we apply that in our lives, and more purposeful about being uniquely Christian in a world where we're called to be different, to be unique, and to challenge the things of this world.
Great points, Chuck. Great points. I suppose some of the angst that I have relates to perhaps what I had hoped my life would be. Of course, when I was a boy, Chuck, I was into sports, football and baseball. My teams were the Pittsburgh Pirates for baseball and the Pittsburgh Steelers for football. And my heroes on both teams were the leaders. So I thought, boy, I really want to be like Terry Bradshaw. I want to be very much Bert Blyleven, John Candelaria, Willie Stargell, Dave Parker, Bill Madlock. But the truth is, when push came to shove, I very much was not interested in being in the leadership class. Now, what I mean by that is there are a set of second order benefit from being a Christian nation. So we speak of you and I, we speak of the gospel, and we speak of the Christian message as progressing through the centuries, whether the Lord sends us to a culture that is profoundly non-Christian or anti-Christian, or whether He puts us in a place that is Christian, in some senses is not material. But some of the secondary consequences and benefits of cultural Christianity or Christendom, for lack of a better word, I really do miss. I would say that the world since 2003 to 2005, starting with the new atheism, is considerably more savage. And I think there was a time in the Pax Americana when I had the privilege of enjoying a gentler world. Now, somebody will say, well, it was gentle and kind for you, but not everyone. And my friend, you're right. But at the same point in time, we don't improve things by regressing to the mean. And my idea really was that the Christendom behind the Pax Britannia and the Pax Americana would in fact continue to be a blessing, not just to Great Britain, not just to America, but to the entire Christian West. I sense a fatigue in Western culture towards Christianity, and alienation, and if I can put it glibly, at the risk of oversimplification, I almost feel that people are sick of prosperity. People are sick of wholesome living. People are sick of gentleness and civility and kindness. Now, that's, of course, not fair in certain ways. I think it's really reasonable to say that most people would like the blessings and benefits that a kind and gentle society can provide. But the truth is that even if we want the benefits, it's not clear that we always want to make the investment that will produce the benefits. And I think whatever we can say about previous generations, imperfect as they were, there really was a heritage of making that investment. I'm looking at a very interesting volume here, Ralph Barton Perry, Puritanism and Democracy, published in 1944. And Ralph Barton Perry was a professor at Harvard University in the middle part of the century. He was a student of John Dewey, and he was a critic of the American culture in its puritanistic characteristics. And so the point of his work, Puritanism and Democracy, is to take a look at the leading ideas of the 17th and 18th century America, talk about weaknesses and strengths, and derive some lessons from them for his own day. Now, here's the interesting thing, because I would assess that Ralph Barton Perry is, in the mid-20th century, he's an example of a professor grappling with, a critic of, an opponent of, I almost want to say, in the culture wars, an opponent of Puritanism in its American forms, but at least in his work, Puritanism and Democracy, there is a sense that Perry, even a critic, even as an opponent, acknowledges that so much of what made the parts of America that were great, what made that greatness, had to do so much with the Puritan theology and the Puritan outlook that was associated with it. And for me, the collapse is made clear by the fact that just now, 60 or 70 years after Perry, there really is a new narrative about what democracy in the West is, and for the most part always has been. And that is this French Revolution, Enlightenment, liberty, secular humanism. And if you look at the parts of America that were great, what made America great was this Geisteswissenschaften, the importation of European secular sensibilities, the Kantian Revolution, the Hegelian thought, the young Hegelian movements, all of these movements that were so strongly secularizing. That's what's made America great, to the degree that America ever was great. And now, when those things are threatened, there's a transition. People today think that if liberal values understood in this cultural ethos of a secular French Enlightenment are threatened, then quote unquote democracy is at stake. And so in that regard, any situation where I want to present a Christian alternative that's largely based in the Puritan system, which preceded it, it's largely rejected today as ahistorical, as being not, of course, of any value to the American liberal experiment, and a return to some sort of declension. And that, to me, is grievous. If we cannot agree that Puritanism still deserves a hearing in the marketplace of ideas, and by the way, I think that it's a dead letter. In an era of cancel culture, of very extreme controlling of narratives by society using a sort of soft power to exclude things as inappropriate, this sort of Overton window approach to defining what we can talk about, well, it really looks like Puritanism has been defined to be out of bounds. And so in that respect, when I talk about this beautiful tradition that, in my own understanding, is such a fundamental bedrock of what did make Great Britain great, what did make the United States great for the senses that it were, and the senses that I would love to see other countries adopt so that they too could be great, namely the blessing of God. To the degree that that's now considered hate speech, considered bigotry, it is extremely a declension. And you're absolutely right to point out that the church can thrive in places where it's not only not a majority, but where it is repressed or a minority or even persecuted. That doesn't mean that would be my preference, to live in such a society. And so with that in mind, it's a bit of the same sort of situation as perhaps an English professor trying to sell students today on Shakespeare, on Plato, on Homer, and the other classics. If you are a part of the secular liberal Geisteswissenschaften, then you get a hearing. But if you are part outside of that, then you've been removed. You're on the outs list. Shakespeare is now labeled a bigot. It's now labeled part of historical language that is ultimately oppressive and should be discarded. And there's great harm. There's great harm in that, Chuck, from my point of view. And so I think that's a big concern for me here in 2023. As wonderful as it is to thrive under harsher conditions, and by the way, I'll thrive in the soil the Lord grants by his grace. But Chuck, I can't help but want to thrive in a better ground and really to see things be where they are now. It doesn't look like better ground. And so I think that's an important consideration for me. Let me throw it over to you to get to push back on, or maybe take a different step or pivot.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much more to add on that. I think obviously it's much harder, and we don't want to live in a culture where we're no longer within the realm of acceptable ways of thinking. I'm perhaps not as. I think for me the difference is that perhaps where we were before was not as Christian as what we sometimes think it was. So that's really about my only pushback on that. But certainly I think regardless, our response needs to be, regardless of anything, is to first of all continue to be the church, to continue worshiping the God of Scripture, continue studying Scripture, continue praising God in all we do, and living out God's will in our lives throughout our lives, not just in church, but in our work and in our relationships and in our recreation and all those kinds of things. And I think in the end, we have the confidence that God will bless us. And while he doesn't promise easy days, he doesn't promise that we won't experience opposition, he also does promise that we have a hope and a future, and we can live lives of joy even in the midst of struggle. And I think it's really important for us then to continue to be a part of the church and continue to be a part in trying to grow the church and in being a part of doing the work of the church and doing that in our lives every day as well. And even if it means at times dealing with repercussions, living lives that reflect God's will, even out in our work and in our communities, et cetera, et cetera. So whether we're more focused on the fact that things are changing away from the way we'd like them to be, or whether we're more focused on that there's an opportunity for the church in those circumstances, either way, the response is really similar. And what does that mean for Reformed theology today, which is where we started? And I think that there's still some real very basic things that we need to always stick to. We need to stick to this idea of we were living in misery, but we were delivered from that misery, and now we live lives of gratitude. We need to stick with the idea that God is a God who reigns over everything and is sovereign over all, and so it is our duty to obey him in every part of our lives. And those are some of the things I think that they're not necessarily foreign to other traditions, but especially in the Reformed tradition, I think we have an understanding of those things and really ought to be living those things out every day.
Amen, my friend. Amen. I think I've talked at a macro level for most of this discussion, and I think I'd like to pull back into a sort of micro level. What do I see happening at an individual level as a generalization across people today, without trying to sound old and curmudgeonly? Because Chuck, you and I probably have a lot of experiences, many of them fond, back of the good old days, in which the old curmudgeons would sit at the local watering hole or the local barber shop or the local street corner or wherever it was that people would gather and complain about just how bad it was getting. And I think there's something to that. I don't want to be that person. I think at a micro level, wonder if I can say it in an edifying way. I'm concerned that religion is very often being defined in the absence of in-depth investigation of its theology, of the rich heritage that it actually gives. I'm very surprised and shocked to see that, by and large, long form content in social media is relatively unpopular. Not all of my shock there is critical. I myself love to consume videos and short content that's short and concise and to the point. But there are just aspects of religion, especially with respect to apologetics, religion versus an aggressive secularism, where that's very difficult. And I'm dismayed because popularizers can reduce theological discussion, and very often that's helpful, but also very often that's in that reduction, some absurdity is taken. And when we start reducing religious inquiry, very often out comes the cartoon, the cartoonish positions, the demagogues, the silly representations, and to the degree that those are substituted instead of a mature investigation into the issues, I'm greatly dismayed. And I think that's one of the areas where I like talking with you. We get to go into some great details in topics in theology at a high level, typically a graduate level. And I think, unfortunately, the niche there numerically is smaller and smaller. I was thinking about 10 years ago when I was reading Bavinck, I remember saying to myself, I can't wait to talk to all of these people about these wonderful things I'm reading in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, as well as so many other Reformed works. And while numerically, I think Bavinck is more popular than ever in terms of numbers. What I think is the popularity of that in-depth inquiry does not grow as fast as the underlying population set. And so even though we might grow numerically, we might shrink in a relative sense when compared with other things that are growing much more quickly. And so that's been a puzzlement to me. What's the right step there? Do we in Reformed theology take a step back from the depth of inquiry that we do? Do we make it a little shallower? And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Do we try to become popularizers more to reach more people? Or do we continue in this depth and recognize that in some sense that is less relevant? Much like the person who got their PhD in studying Shakespeare 30 years ago today might find themselves in a predicament. 30 years ago, that seemed like a great and wonderful thing to do. By the way, Chuck, it's not just things like being literate in Reformed theology or studying Shakespeare. A generation or two ago, you were set comfortably in life if you could play the piano, and that may seem very funny to people listening today. But in fact, I wonder if keyboards are in popular terms as well as those economic terms on the way out. And I don't mean that it goes to zero, but it becomes less and less relevant and less important. And a generation or two before that, there was the old adage that it was a good thing for your daughter to marry the local butcher, because the thought being in unpredictable economic times 100 years ago, 150 years ago, if you were married to the butcher, of all of the people in the town, hopefully you were one of the ones who had meat. And so too, having skills with the piano 2 generations ago. I know we talk about women in the workforce today. I know so many women 2 generations ago who were very active, and one of the primary ways that they would make and supplement their living would be through playing keyboard, piano, giving lessons to other people, and see that today go by the wayside. I don't mean to say that all of that's bad, but it's just a very stark reminder to me about the nature of the changes. And will there be any Shakespeare in English departments 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And then I remember, it used to, the Greek language, Koine Greek used to be taught. Latin used to be taught in the academy, and now those things are no longer there. So I'm really puzzled and flummoxed what to make of these great changes. But Chuck, at the end of the day, we have a great gospel, a great Savior, and even if things change, the underlying realities are the same: the nature of humankind, the existence of sin, the need for a Savior. None of those things have changed, and in some sense, everything is right where it needs to be, and right where God has ordained it to be. Maybe we come back to that at an ending point here, but let me just throw it over to you, Chuck, for some final thoughts for this discussion session.
Yeah, I think it's been a good discussion, and it's worthwhile both looking back and looking forward, and I think that's part of why we did this today. I'm confident in a God that has not only created history but is directing it in the ways that He has determined and in ways that are good. I'm confident that even when things seem to be at their darkest, as we've seen in places in the Old Testament, there are still, as God pointed out to Elijah, there are still many who are faithful, but of course we also need to be wise to things that are going on around us, and focused on those things as well, and especially focused on not so much the trappings of Christian culture, but really the core of what it means to be a Christian, and the core of God's teaching for us, and the core of what it means to be uniquely Christian and to be sold out and focused on living a God-centered life. So it's good to have those conversations and think about those things. And I appreciate being able to have that conversation today.